Hi, everyone. I'm Ray Nyora, and my colleague Violet is over there. We're both from New York University. Just by way of kind of Bayesian lab history for me personally, I don't know what year it was, but I was looking around, and this was not long after Judea Pearl published his 2009 book, and everyone was, getting into causality and all that good stuff. And I kept looking for software that could, do DAGs and things like that. And I couldn't find anything. The closest I came was this program that folks at Carnegie Mellon developed called Tetrad. Um, and that was kind of clunky to me, and it was hard to manage. And then I stumbled upon Bayesian Lab, and I thought, it's the answer to all my problems, um, which has been, largely true. And so it's been kind of a nice, journey since then. Um, and I think we did present once before, Stefan, it was during COVID time, right?
Yes,
It
yes.
was virtual. It was in that funny virtual space that,
Actually, there was the Laval virtual world.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
I kept getting lost but
But
anyway.
it worked.
But it worked, yeah. All right, so today, as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about cigarette smoking and e-cigarette use. Everyone knows what cigarettes are. Everyone knows what e-cigarettes are. Why do we care about this stuff, right? So first of all, Violet and I are in the School of Public Health. And cigarette smoking, but you can look at the disclosures. Cigarette smoking is, to many of us, seems to be something that's in the rear view mirror, that it's kind of been going away for a long time. But of course, e-cigarette use has been, captivating attention more recently. So in this talk, we'll try to answer a couple of questions, generally speaking. Who are the remaining smokers here in the United States? And to approach that question, we're going to look at a couple of population surveys, National Health Interview Survey and a study called the Population Assessment of Tobacco and Health. I'll tell you more about that later. But then we'll switch to the topic of tobacco harm reduction, which is a little bit more controversial insofar as we're asking the question, can products like e-cigarettes, and there are other tobacco harm or reduced risk products, can they actually help cigarette smokers move away from cigarette smoking? Okay, why do we care about smoking? Again, it's like it's a problem that's going away. So this was published last month in the New England Journal of Medicine. And if you look globally, look at the numbers for smoking compared to, other issues. So uh, on planet Earth, as of 2022, there were an estimated 1.1 billion cigarette smokers on Earth. So it's not an insignificant number, especially from a public health point of view. And as you can see, the annual death rate related to smoking is pretty substantial. So that's why we do what we do. But there's good news here, and kind of everyone knows this. This slide quantifies it. If you quit smoking, you can reverse your risk of premature mortality. And the earlier in life you quit smoking, the better off you'll be. This is true for men and women. This is all cause mortality, but it's true for cancers. It's true for cardiovascular disease. And the estimates are as follows. So if you're younger and you quit sooner, you're going to gain proportionally more, gain back more years of life. Again, that's the big picture motivation. But who still smokes cigarettes, right? Um, well, we think we understand something about that, but as I'll show you, actually, we're still a little bit puzzled. So what people do is, and especially what government health agencies have done, including not only our government but all world governments, the World Health Organization, they have focused on what we call priority populations. And it is true, and this is just a listing of factors that are known to be associated with cigarette smoking. And this is all true. These people in these categories or subgroups are more likely to smoke cigarettes compared to those who do not fall into these categories. Um, but does this tell us, the whole story? So we look at the National Health Interview Survey. This is an annual survey conducted here in the US. It's a representative survey. And they ask a bunch of questions about health, but also health behaviors, including smoking and so forth. And this is how they categorize smokers. So essentially, you can fall. One of us can fall into one of these four categories. You have never smokers, former smokers, current someday smokers. So those are people that don't smoke every day. And then on the far, you're right, um, everyday smokers. And if you count up the everyday and someday smokers, it's around 11-ish%, a little over that. Um, so that's what we're dealing with here in the United States. So that's 11% or so of adults. So even here, it's still not an insubstantial number of people. So it represents around 30 million or so people who are cigarette smokers. So let's go and let's try to predict who the smokers are. So on the right side, left, right, your whatever that side of the graph, you can see all the variables that we picked out of the National Health Interview Survey. So you have e-cigarette use, age, alcohol use, education, ratio of poverty, sex, marital status, ethnicity, veteran status, whether people are disabled, suffering from anxiety, depression, what their sexual orientation is, whether they're taking anxiety or depression medications, what's their employment status, are they born in the US, and what's their race. And if you remember that list of priority populations that I showed you, this covers not the entire list, but it covers a good number of them. And this is just a straightforward nominal logistic regression model. What's displayed here in the figure is something called log worth. It's just a log transformation of the p-values, but it gives you a sense of the magnitude of the effect. And you can see that e-cigarettes come out to be the top predictor of cigarette use. Well, that makes sense because people most likely to use e-cigarettes are going to be smokers already. Non-smokers are much less likely to take up e-cigarettes. But then you see, you know, list of variables that kind of make sense. Age is related. Actually, younger people are more likely to be smokers than older people. People who consume more alcohol, people that are less educated, people that are more poor, etc. Sex, men are more likely to smoke than women. The marital status category, divorced and separated people are more likely to smoke than people who are married, and so forth and so on. So it all kind of makes sense. When we look at how well does the classification model work in terms of these variables? I would argue not great, right? Overall, and you can look at the AUC for the various categories there. And part of the reason is because the models are good at predicting never smokers, but far less good at predicting other categories. We'll come back to that later. So now, what's this relationship between e-cigarette use and smoking? So on the x-axis, you have e-cigarette use, and on the y-axis, you have smoking status. Um, so this is, the distribution of smoking. So you have never smokers, former smokers, small little bit of not everyday smokers, and then current everyday smokers. And you can see that, well, this tells you why there's a relationship. But the thing that matters is here, where you're looking at current e-cigarette users primarily. So yes, there are more smokers who are current e-cigarette users. We call those dual users. But look, proportionately, there are many, many more former smokers in the e-cigarette user category, which means maybe that e-cigarettes, that people are switching away from cigarettes and starting to use e-cigarettes instead. Um, Now, you can look at this as cross-sectional data, et cetera. People look at this figure or similar figures and they say e-cigarette use is causing smoking. All right. And I'm not kidding. It's like, okay, but obviously you can have, different interpretations. All right, now let's have some fun with Bayesian labs. So basically took the same data set, have smoking status as the target variable, and largely, ran a naive Bayes model, and largely confirmed what we saw in the logistic model. And, again, looking at the area under the curve, and it's pretty, generally speaking, pretty consistent. Um, but then we love Bayesian lab because we can do things. So this is augmented naive Bayes, and we get better performance with this model. But we also get, uh, and you can see there's slightly better prediction here. But the nice thing about this is we also have a more interesting story to tell because we know all these factors are interrelated, and the ordinary linear model, a paradigm assumes independence, and that's just not the way the world works. And if you look at how these things kind of relate to one another, and I'll show you another slide in a minute, you'll see why it kind of makes sense. So let me just go quickly. And then for Lionel, I couldn't resist doing semi-supervised learning. I'm not sure exactly why, except that it was an option and I did it. um, but what I did here, and it performs about as well as the augmented naive Bayes. But here, I also did some variable clustering, and you can see again, there's more of a story to tell here. That it's not just this, simple one-to-one relationship between these variables and smoking status, and things make sense. If you're a policy person, this should make you think a little bit more about what you can and can't, influence, right? You can't influence things like, age. You can influence maybe, poverty status or education. What effects would those, changes in those variables have on outcomes? So you could do those kinds of what if scenarios in a more realistic way. Anyway. So this is also, unsupervised learning. We did the same thing here with the maximum spanning tree, similar story. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about tobacco harm reduction. As I said, the idea here is that there are safer, not safe, but safer products that people can switch to if they're cigarette smokers. This is controversial. Our government here in the US now has the authority to regulate all tobacco products, the Food and Drug Administration. Um, they, they are in charge of authorizing reduced risk products. They've been in business for about 15 years. Um, they have had 40 million applications for authorization of reduced risk products. 40 million. How many have they authorized in the past 15 years? Wild guess. 23. All right. The system is broken. Part of the reason is because the government is being super conservative, and they don't believe that these products are actually reduce risk, and we'll get into that in a minute. However, not in this country, but in other countries, people have been busy doing randomized clinical trials of, e-cigarettes for smoking cessation. And as of late 2023, the Cochrane um, uh, library, you may be familiar with them. They do a lot of meta analytic work and reports. And they concluded from meta analysis that e cigarette actually do help smokers quit smoking. And they're as, if not more effective than other so-called approved methods. So that's varenicline or Chantix, and this is the nicotine patch. So we have pretty good evidence from RCTs that these products can help. Um, and so the logic here is kind of backwards, right? Because you would assume that the RCTs would be enough to convince a government agency that there's some efficacy here. But the government agency says, no, we need observational research instead, which is like kind of crazy, but this is what they do. Um, this is also from the National Health Interview Survey. So we looked at this data recently. They asked people, well, what have you been using to try to quit smoking? Right at the top, e-cigarettes. So actually, smokers are themselves, without government authorization, using e-cigarette products as a way to try to get away from smoking cigarettes. So this is a good example of people doing what people want to do, um, despite the government actually being neutral or actually kind of being negative on this whole thing. But are they connected? So this is quarterly data from 2019 to third quarter of 2023, and here we have smoking rates, and they've gone down now even more compared to the slide I showed you earlier, about 10.6%. And look, we're seeing this, gradual increase in e-cigarette use. So are these two curves interrelated? So to try to get at that, we looked at data from something called a PATH study. And this is actually funded by the FDA. Um, and it's a lot, it's a population study. So they sample of the entire US population. But it's longitudinal in nature. And there are very, very few national surveys that have a longitudinal component following the same people over time. And this is one of those. PAT study is not only about tobacco, but it's also about health outcomes and just a ton of information. And this gives you a sense of the sample size. There was a youth component, an adult component. Wave 7 data, I think were just released in the past 2 weeks. We haven't gotten to that yet. But I'll talk about data that comes from wave 1 through wave 6. So from what does that say, 2013 or 14 or so to 2021. And this is the information that I'll talk about. I think in the PAT study, there are over 10,000 variables assessed per person. There's biomarker data, et cetera, but I won't get into any of that. Just kind of a simple look at some basic things. But we're focusing on, e-cigarettes and cigarette use. So here's what the population looks like. It's detailed, you don't need to go into it, but it's even though this is unweighted data, the only thing that's not representative is the fact that we have a lot of smokers in the sample because smokers were oversampled. They wanted to get more information from smokers. But in terms of results of analyses and so forth, the weighting doesn't change the substance of it. So first thing we did some unsupervised learning. And so again, this is similar to the National Health Interview Survey. We see that there's, you know, there are these interrelationships that kind of make sense. Once again, we see there's an association between cigarette use and e-cigarette use. Um, and if we plot the data, and this is actually number of days that people have either smoked cigarettes or used e-cigarettes per month. So it's kind of a rough measure of use. And you see um, some convergence in terms of the direction of the curves. One of the issues though is the data look like this. So you see on the cigarette side here, very few people are smoking at zero. Well, let me tell you why. One reason is that there's oversampling of smokers, but most smokers are smoking almost every day. That's kind of common. Most people are not e-cigarette users, but there's a tiny little bump right at the top there, meaning that those are the people that are using every single day, smoking every single day. A tiny little bump actually has some meaning. So we did a repeated measures analysis, and this is a response surface profile. And you have three axes, so you have time wave here. You have the mean number of days that people are smoking, and then the mean number of days that they're using e-cigarettes. And you can see that over time, people who are using e-cigarettes more frequently are smoking less or less often. Um, and then if we look at just the status of those two variables, so people who report no smoking, this is actually a good news story. So again, this is longitudinal data. These are the same people. You see the increase in quit rates over time. And then, somewhat of an increase in e-cigarette use as well. Um, so here, what we did is we just put that data into Bayesian lab, and this is the monitored data. The C's indicate cigarette smoking, and we put them in, we bin them into three categories. Both case e-cigarettes and cigarettes, we discretized where we isolated the zeros. But again, we were also interested in everyday use for the e-cigarettes, so we put them in a separate category. And you notice that if you just follow, you know, the zeros here, you see that the proportion of people who are no longer smoking increases from wave to wave. Um, and then if you follow the 30-day or everyday e-cigarette users, that also increases. Not as much, but it does increase from wave to wave. So are these things connected? So we set up a cross-lag panel model in Bayesian Lab, and so these are all, we didn't learn this. These are um, fixed arcs, et cetera. But this is basically what it looks like, and this is the Pearson's R, and you have to take that with a grain of salt because it's maybe not the best measure of association, but it's somewhat more interpretable. Um, and you can see, just in terms of, again, kind of a time series here, you have a lot of consistency across time in the cigarette smokers. And that makes sense because cigarette smoking is addictive. People who, that's the reason that people stay as cigarette smokers for long, long periods of time, sometimes even lifetimes, is because there's a stickiness there. There's some consistency in e-cigarette use, but not as much as with cigarettes. But what we're interested in are, kind of the lagged relationships. So back to this mosaic plot here, and you can see These are the everyday e-cigarette users compared to those who are non-users. All right, more more quitters, more cigarette quitters. It's still not a huge population effect because, proportionally, not that many people are using e-cigarettes. But but this is a clear effect, and it's cross lag effect, and this is from wave 2 to 3. So what we did is we set evidence. We said, well, what happens if we turn every e-cigarette uh, user into turn everyone into everyday e-cigarette users? And by the way, these are in these relationships, everyone is a smoker at the very beginning. And what we do when we do that, we see an increase in quitting from 17 to roughly 32%. So that's kind of cool. We did the same thing later on in time and similar relationship, but actually higher now because remember quit rates were going up across time, but we see the same thing. An almost doubling of cigarette quit rates if you assume that everyone switches to become an everyday e-cigarette smoker. Um, why would e-cigarettes do this? Now we saw results from the randomized clinical trial that people can be given e-cigarettes to quit smoking and it helps them. It turns out that actually you don't even need to do that. Cigarette smokers who, for whatever reason, they may not even be wanting to quit smoking, they try e-cigarettes, and if they manage to migrate successfully, they can quit. And there's studies showing um, that this holds true. And this is from the PAT study. When we looked at people who said, at the beginning, no, I'm not interested in quitting smoking. But if they took up to e-cigarettes, they actually were more likely to quit without the motivation. So that's very interesting because, and this slide just shows you, here are the odds ratios for quitting, and this is reducing the number of cigarettes. Um, so that's pretty interesting because um, it suggests that the e-cigarettes don't need to be branded as a smoking cessation tool. They just kind of work. All right. Caveat, everyone's afraid of e-cigarettes. Well, not everyone. So what's the safety? What's the safety profile of e-cigarettes? We don't have long-term epidemiological data on the effects of e-cigarettes on, never smokers. But all the biomarker data that we have from numerous studies suggests that if people switch from cigarettes to e-cigarettes, that all biomarkers of harm are decreased substantially and usually to levels of those of non-smokers. But this is still kind of a controversial area. Let me just wrap up. So we kind of know who smokers are, um, and especially in terms of in some inequalities, but that actually doesn't represent necessarily the majority of smokers, and we need to get more tools out and available to them. E-cigarettes are out there. They're not a therapeutic product. They're a commercial product. They're a consumer product. They're available, and they may benefit smokers. The downside, well, they're sold by tobacco companies who also sell cigarettes. And this is where there's a lot of controversy in public health. It's like, do these represent an advancement in terms of actual scalable interventions in population health, or are we being somehow manipulated by the tobacco industry again? Um, and I'll leave you with that message. And then finally, just based on Lionel's presentation yesterday, and additional discussions. This paper, found this paper, so it's from the future. You can see June 24th, 2024. It's pretty cool. Um, so, there's people are working on this stuff and it seems pretty cool. And they have a whole bunch of prompts in terms of assessing, causality and so forth. So I'll stop there and take questions.